Welcome to A Writer's Diary. I'm Cara Brookins, and this is page 3. If you've been writing along with me, you have about 50 to 75 pages of your novel complete. Well, not complete exactly. They're hundreds of editing hours away from complete, but hopefully they're at least written. And I do hope that you're writing with me, because a big part of the writing process is learning your way of writing. This is not a how-to video, because every writer has their own way of finding their way through a novel, and each writer even has a unique way of finding their way through each individual novel. So this video is intended more if you're stuck along the way and you want to see how another writer found their way through a novel, or maybe if this is your first novel and you're just not sure how to put it all together. I hope some of these tips will help. Now at this point, you've set up the protagonist and the antagonist, and you have a decent idea where they're going. And you've also set up some of the minor characters along the way. And at this point, you're just starting off into what we'd call the hero's journey. This is just launching off into the plot of the story. Things are just starting to get really interesting. And your character, your protagonist, are really starting to have to dig deep. And most writers understand and know this about the character at this point, that the character has to really dig deep into some of the more emotional themes of the novel. But what about the writer? The truth is, right here is where the writer also has to dig deep. It's true for them too. Because this is where you discover those underlying themes of your story. And this is where we kind of understand that each scene in a novel is not really about what the scene appears to be about, that there's something deeper underlying it. And really that becomes true of the whole novel, that there has to be something deeper. So this is where things start to get really complex, and we have all these subtle nuances that weren't apparent in the introductory chapters of the novel, or maybe they were less apparent. And generally they become more apparent as you go back and edit those. And this is where your outlines and your notes become a lot more complex. And that's really whether you consider yourself a pantser or a plotter and you have really specific outlines. Either way, your thought process here has to become a lot more complex. You have to kind of begin to see the larger picture and not only see each chapter and character as you're looking at it then, but you're looking 3 or 4 chapters ahead, and you're looking 3 or 4 layers deep. So this is when a story becomes three-dimensional, and that's a really exciting part, because you have all of these like arcs and mini arcs and different story points that are colliding with one another. And this is also when a lot of people give up on a book, because it is complex. And it's really unfortunate that they give up here, because this is when it starts to get really fun. But I find really often that I'll talk to a writer who I haven't talked to in months or maybe even a year at a writer's conference, and when I ask them about how their current novel is going, they start to describe the plot, and I start to think, gee, this sounds really familiar. And it's because it's the same story they told me about last time I talked to them, and they haven't progressed past this point right here, this 50 to 75 page mark, where they're launching off into the story and everything starts to get out of hand. But the reason this part should be fun is because there's a trick to maintaining control here, and that's really what you have to do. You have to maintain control of your story. And think of yourself at this stage as like a minor god who's creating their own universe, and you're just coming into your own power. So you're learning how to control all of these underlings who are under your power. And too many authors will say at this point that the book is something that plays like a movie in their head, and that they just have to write down what they see, and they really have no control over what their characters do. The characters just do what they want, and the author has to write it down. Now, if this is true, if you truly have no control over your story, then this will be really apparent to the reader. You have to maintain control. It's going to be obvious if you lose it. Now, I understand what authors mean when they say this. They mean that a character did something unexpected, or a scene went in a direction that they didn't plan on, or even that an entire character appeared that they had no intention of putting in this novel, and now they have to wait and see where this is going to go. So I understand what they mean when they say that, but this is not like blind finger painting. And if you don't take charge of the story, it will begin to look like blind finger painting. And that's when it does start to fall apart, and why people sort of become paralyzed and give up at that point. When the author says that this book is just playing like a movie in their head, I think what they're trying to describe is the way that a character is coming into themselves, and their personality is becoming very apparent. For example, I mentioned in the last installment, in page 2, about taking like a Myers-Briggs personality test with your character as the subject taking the test. And this is so that you could establish a really strong personality for your character. Now, if you've done this, or whatever work you've done to create this strong personality, then this character has become a true, real entity that will not conform to things that don't fit with their personality. So what's really happening is that you're sensing that this character doesn't fit into the scene that you thought they were going to fit into, or you're sensing intuitively that a scene is not just going to go in the direction that you wanted it to, because maybe the setting or some other element of time and space is really not going to fit where you originally thought it was going to go, because you've done more of your world and character building than you had when you conceived of that direction or that scene. So if, for example, if you've set up a character and you've established this character type of, here's a girl who owns pet piranhas, and then you had planned for a scene later in the book where she's going to fight for PETA. Well, when you get to the scene, the character is going to naturally resist the scene, because you've already established them as a character who wouldn't naturally fall into that. And it will feel like this character is taking on a mind of their own and taking control of the story. But in truth, what is happening is that you created this girl. You created her personality type. And she's only behaving in the way that you have established. You've already established these rules. So she's behaving within the boundaries that you've set up for her. So the reason that people give up at this point is because they don't recognize that that's what's happening, that they've made the rules and the characters are trying to behave within them. But when that behavior falls outside of your original outline, you fail to become flexible enough to move the story along. And that's when things start to fall apart, because things go in unintended directions, and then rather than revising the outline, people have a habit of just tossing it out altogether and trying to see where the characters want to go. And without structure, you have blind finger painting, and that will not work for any story, for any reader. So recognize when this happens that it's not some sort of a spiritual event where a muse in the form of your character is taking control of your fingertips at the keyboard, but rather it's an intellectual resistance for the character's personality or a scene's integrity. So please maintain control of your story. I'll give you an example of this in the novel that I'm currently working on, which is Rise, and it's a psychological thriller that's based on real-life events of my kids and I building our own home from the ground up. Now, I face these elements and challenges, and I'm about 70 pages into this novel, and I've been writing this scene where my kids and I are working in the trenches of the foundation of this house. And I get really sort of caught up in the physical elements of the scene and what it felt like to be knee-deep in this freezing cold mud in December, and with my kids along beside me, and we had our feet shoved into plastic bags inside of our shoes because we didn't have any boots, and we're trying to keep our feet dry, and there's this spring that has launched in the corner of this foundation, so there's actually running water through this foundation, and we're 2.5 feet deep into the earth, and we're kneeling in mud and trying to get rebar to prop up onto rocks and rebar chairs so that we can pour the foundation of this house. So I get really stuck in the visceral parts of that. What did that feel like? What did that smell like? And even the dialogue elements, like what were my kids and I talking about? And honestly, we were laughing about. So there's a lot of laughter in this scene. And it's really easy to get caught up in those elements and not dig a little deeper, because the scene is not about what the scene is about. It's not just about us digging in mud or about us laughing. It's about a family digging deep, literally, but also figuratively. Digging deep, and how messy it is to recover from domestic violence, and how messy life is when you're trying to rebuild a family and rediscover the boundaries of yourself. So those are the deeper elements of what the scene is, and that's the digging deep part. That is what makes the scene three-dimensional. And even the laughter in the scene is about a lot more than just humor if you peel back several layers of the story, and that you really need to find that dimension in your writing to make those deeper underlying themes stand out. And I also have to remind myself to maintain control, even though most of all of the major scenes in this novel are real events. I also fictionalized it, so these are the parts that are easy for me to lose control of in this novel, which would be different in other novels that I've written. And particularly, I included a supernatural element in this story, and the supernatural element isn't a major part of the underlying theme, at least at this point it isn't, but it is a part of the plot. And the supernatural element could have a tendency to get too strong, because it's a very strong voice. And if I don't really pay attention, this part of the story could get away from me and try to take charge and take it in a direction that I had never intended. So this is the part where I have to remember that I'm God of this universe, and I have to take control of this minion, because in this universe, even these supernatural minions are under my control. So I have to maintain that control. So to review, I covered 3 points that are going to rise when you're probably about 50 to 75 pages into a traditional length novel. And you'll find that you'll need to dig deep, because this is where your plot is really starting to take off, and you have to watch out to include the underlying themes, and use these themes to make a three-dimensional story, and especially to maintain control of your story. Don't get lazy. Don't lose track of everything so that it becomes some sort of a blind finger painting expedition. Maintain control and be God of your universe. So keep writing. Check back soon for page 4. And remember, you can find out more about me at www.CaraBrookins.com. Follow me on Twitter at CMBrookins, and of course you can find my books on Amazon.com. So this is Cara Brookins with A Writer's Diary, and I look forward to seeing you in page 4.